Not videoing the class, I'm videoing me lecturing so that I can post it on YouTube. I don't even watch me on YouTube. It's that bad, you know, so. But I'll put it there. I don't know if it's any good, but my YouTube account's old enough and used enough that they usually let me post fairly long segments. So started off like the most you could do is like 5 minutes or something. So the very first video, I think I already showed you how to study Hegel. Mm-hmm. No? Yes?
Yeah,
yes. So it's what, a minute? A minute and 2 seconds, something like that. I wanted to make sure it would load. It's my how-to video. There is action in it. If you watch my slipper, I didn't actually realize it, but I wiggle my foot. Learn stuff about yourself when you. What's kind of amazing about this is I've actually had responses to this, video responses. One guy has actually replied with how to think about Nietzsche in German. But I've had 13,000 views, which is kind of amazing. And I've had all kinds of people critiquing it, saying, in different languages, so that's kind of interesting. So I can use, I'm going to video this in case we get some folks not coming because of the weather. In fact, I'm sure that at least 2 people are not coming because they emailed me and said they weren't. Isabel's in a later class. I'll have to video both classes. So then, and the thing is, this is like the climactic point of the course for me too, because everyone in the academic community, and we're actually about, what, 4 or 5 minutes early, so I'm not really starting class. But basically everyone in the academic community, in at least Western universities, whatever that is, once we discovered the Earth was round, it was kind of odd to think of one hemisphere as the West and the other as the East. We decided that. And then you get the odd thing about Alaska being the easternmost and westernmost state in the Union, which is kind of cool. Because of that. Have you ever gone across the date line, the international date line? It's fun. One particular day I was on a Coast Guard cutter that went back and forth across the date line, they said 4 times. So while we were on the ship, and it was a beautiful day, we were like wondering, what day is it? Is it Sunday or is it Saturday? You know, we weren't sure. It was part of the day it was Sunday, part of the day it was Saturday, depending on where we were. Going back and forth. So that's obvious. But if you're in a Western academic environment, you are at least going to be a Kantian, in the sense that Kant has been accepted as answering Hume. And part of that answer is that David Hume was right in his criticisms of previous philosophy. So the idea that science, for example, can never say that they actually prove anything. That's a vocabulary change, thanks to David Hume, who basically undercut the idea of proof in the sense that empirical information is really based on our memories, and our memories are faulty, so none of our memories of past events are literally considered as guaranteed as things like mathematics. I'm not actually starting yet. I got 2 minutes.
Come here, go.
I did. Halloween was over.
So no more Wolfman.
I'll tell you though, it was a real shock. I did this to myself, and then I discovered it was cold.
Yeah.
I lost all my fur, and that
Yep.
was. But I did it to myself.
Self-mutilation.
I have the clipper. I have the attachment. This is a 4. I have the different size
Yep.
attachments. This is a 4. So I just put the 4 on there, and I just
Zip.
the whole thing. So I am videoing this, believe it or not.
Oh. Why?
A couple of students emailed and said they weren't coming because of the weather, and I thought,
Oh,
you know,
that thing.
that's going to ruin this program. If all of our Alaska Middle College School students come from Palmer and Wasilla, not all do, but if you have so many there and you have snow days, and being Alaska, we occasionally have snow.
Yeah.
Occasionally, and when we do, you know, if it boggles up the road like it did yesterday, as a result of that, they decide, you know, this is a really foolish idea. Let's go to Eagle River every morning for school. No, that's not going to go over very well, I think. If that means you spend 3 hours on the bus,
Well, but they know that coming in.
get here just in time to miss all your classes. Then get back on the bus and spend another 3 hours going back. Nobody wants to do that. Unless it's a really cool bus.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, Miss Frizzle doesn't drive the bus. A trip of a drip. How many cute books?
Lily Tomlin, you bet. Magic schools.
Yeah, magic school. Pardon?
It's been like a decade since I last heard that name.
Well,
Right
yeah.
on the magic school bus.
Well, when you have children, you're going to be destroyed, you know, because you will start talking in rhyme.
Yes.
Everything you say will be to the time.
Hmm.
It will be no then, except for when, or whatever. Well, so you'll be, your tongue will be numb. You'll eat ham and eggs in a boat with a goat, and you will like them. You will like them. Sam, you let me be. No, sorry. See, I'm mentally destroyed. But back to Kant. So if you're ensconced in the Western academic environment, Kant's answer to Hume has been accepted as at least minimally correct. I'll have to explain the minimal because Kant's not the end of it, of course. But he does answer Hume, so we can do metaphysics. What we have to do is hypothesize that there must be an observer to the phenomena, and there must actually be things in themselves. You can't have an interaction between an observer and things in themselves unless both of those exist. Right? But then he goes on to say, as I started by drawing my little chart, so to speak, that in order for us to observe phenomena and for phenomena to be ordered the way it is, and it is ordered, we have to have a sense of time, number one. We have to have a sense of space. number two. And neither of those things come from the phenomena itself, because thanks to Hume, the phenomena we're talking about are the immediate perceptions that I'm having at the moment. So all the judgments that I make about, say, distance, contiguity in time and space, sequencing, so cause and effect relationships, you know, colors being the same, the relationships between all these ideas, all of those can't come from the phenomena per se, which is Latin for in itself, basically, right, per se. So what I have to do is assume that something else structures all of those perceptions. Not the things in themselves. The structure comes from, for Kant, our minds, right? So something in our minds orders all of that. And certainly to a big extent, or a great extent, however you want to properly say that, we believe today that there's a whole bunch of things that are typically human in the way we experience the world. So our eyes function relatively the same way, although of course there's a range of differences between people that are blind, people that see other colors that are not necessarily shared by everyone else. Synesthesia, if you have kind of a merging of all your experiences together, some people do that. So when you hear certain sounds, you also see colors with them, and so on. Right? I've met people that have all those experiences. So our range of abilities visually is one sense, is not exactly the same for everyone. There's a range of differences among us, right? But nonetheless, there's very clear boundaries to all humans in that regard, and that is we don't see infrared, we don't see ultraviolet, we don't see electricity, although we can certainly feel it, right? But we think of all of these things as waves, right? So the electromagnetic spectrum is a spectrum. Right? It goes from all kinds of waves to, and we're niched in just a very small range inside of that. And so what we can experience of the world, this is common sense today, but notice this comes from Kant, and that we're all experiencing what's out there through this small range, but we can use devices now in order to explore a great variety of inputs that would not be observable by a human being, right? So it's also obvious that there's lots of things out there that we don't see. I have a parakeet. When I look at the parakeet, I know that there are ultraviolet colors coming from the feathers of the bird that other parakeets would see, but I'm totally unable to notice, right? Those things are used as communication between parakeets and so on. I don't see it because of the limit of my human range and so on. I don't see heat, for example. So if you're a snake, you know, I don't know if anybody's in Slytherin house, but if you're a snake, you can see heat, you know, body heat. You can't see other things, you know. So snakes, for example, can see outside of the range of human beings. So there's lots of things that say, okay, so the way we perceive the world is structured by our common humanity. And there's a limit to that, which means that we're not seeing the world as it really is in itself, as John Locke pretty much suggested. So that empirical development with John Locke and with Berkeley and then with Hume and resolved pretty much then with Kant, so to speak, tells us, yes, in fact, that we cannot see the world as it is in itself. What we do is see the world through human eyes, hear it through human ears, etc. Right? Which means that our human nature structures this experience. So the question then is, well, how does that structure work? Where does that structuring come from? And Kant basically didn't answer that question. He said, well, it's if you're a rational human being, this is the way you do it. You structure it through time, you structure it through space, you structure it through having all of basically the Aristotelian categories that Aristotle applied to substance themselves, but now, thanks to the Kantian revolution, we now recognize as the kinds of characteristics that we impose on the phenomena. So we experience things as having unity, plurality. Everything has unity and plurality. And it's not that the thing itself is in some way contradictory because it's both one and many. That was the problem. Since the Greeks embedded those characteristics in the things themselves, they couldn't quite figure out how these aporias, where the thing somehow was both one and many, could have that characteristic. That's a contradiction. How could it be? But since it's categories of our understanding or our judgment that we impose on things, and we impose the same categories on all of those things, then that confounding problem that the Greeks had went away. Because we're the ones that put that kind of filter on it and impose that structure. But Kant didn't really answer the question of how that structure was imposed. Is it our biology? Would be one problem, right? Would it be something else, actually? How does this structure impose itself on you? And it's already obvious, even in Köln, or I'm sorry, Königsberg. I'm thinking Köln because I was reading something about Köln the other day. St. Ursula, but that's a squirrel. Königsberg, where Kant lived, not everyone thought the same way. So it's interesting that Kant said, if you're a rational person, you structure things this way. Well, who determines who's rational? Who determines who gets to choose what the correct framework is that all human beings ought to experience? And this also affects our ethics. So for example, the quiz question, right, that I asked. What would you do if you're in traffic, all the cars are backed up, and three ugly guys, notice I suggested they were ugly guys, started pounding on the beautiful young lady's car right next to you, right? And you're sitting there, what do you do, right? Wonderful question. Most of you, and I asked it in two parts. The first part was, what would be your moral obligation? For Kant, our rational structuring of phenomena includes the moral. So for Kant, you have a categorical imperative. It comes from the categories of the way we structure things, and it's an imperative, a moral obligation. So just in the same way that I see that's a triangle, that's a square, that's a circle, right? As long as I'm thinking rationally, I have to judge it that way. Otherwise, there's something wrong with me, right? But just as absolutely as I can tell that clock is oval in shape, when I see an activity that has a moral aspect to it, I have a sense of what is right and wrong. Absolutely. That's why when I draw my ethical map, I put Kant in the box up at the top and say this is a deontological point of view. You have a duty, you have a moral duty, and you know it. So the first question I asked with regard to the woman in the car, what's your moral obligation? Right? And notice we had everyone agree that your obligation was to interfere in some way. Moral obligation, interfere. And how many of, let me break it up this way. For the second part, what would you actually do? I'll ask the guys first. You feel like your obligation is to actually would you actually get out of the car and try to interfere in some way?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes? Right, and then when I'm looking at the women and their response, how many of you felt like the best thing to do would be to get on the cell phone and call the police?
You talking about the Detroit thing?
Yes.
Oh, I'd be involved.
You'd
I've
be
done that
involved.
before.
You'd be
Oh, yeah.
involved. I've had Alaskan women in my class and say, oh, I just got my shotgun out and
Yeah.
blow them away, you know.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so there's a little range of difference, but it does strike me as interesting that males typically feel like they physically ought to get involved, whereas the females tend to feel like what they want to do is call for help.
Well, I will call the cops first.
Yeah. Now, well, I think when I first started asking this question, though, I don't think we had cell phones. So that wouldn't have been actually an option. It was interesting to me how as cell phones became popular, more and more people thought, the right thing to do would be to call the police to come and help. But the other thing I would like to suggest too is that it is actually cultural, because if that happened in Saudi Arabia, your probable first thought was, well, good for the police. Those three ugly guys are probably the police, and they're beating her up because she's not allowed to drive. She's breaking the moral law. Who let that woman out there on her own? She should have her husband with her. There's no way she should be behind the steering wheel. And if she could even see to drive, obviously she wasn't wearing the correct outfit, because if you're wearing that outfit, you wouldn't be able to see to drive, right? Because all you could see is this. I remember the one cartoon that was won one of the awards when they were asking for cartoons making fun of Muhammad in the Dutch newspaper. And one of the winning cartoons showed a picture of, the women were all they could see was this, and Muhammad, all he had was a blinder, so it was kind of a ridiculous joke about the way the Sharia law works with regard to women. But the interesting result of this is that our gut feeling that you ought to defend that woman is not a universal human response to that. There are cultures where that's perfectly expected, actually, for people to beat her up. I mean, we think of that as absolutely horrendous, and notice that that's a real problem for us. When we see, women being treated the way they are in some Indian communities, we think that's horrible. And India itself seems to be embarrassed by that, and yet not so embarrassed. It seems like one of the reasons they feel that embarrassment is not because they think it's wrong, but because they're embarrassed that we're reacting that way. Not that kind of treatment of women in India is wrong. So when it comes to morality, it doesn't seem to be a universal character trait for us to all interpret a particular act as an absolute categorical imperative that we all, because we're biologically human and rational. So it could be the rational part that causes that. But it is amazing if we structure that question in, say, a typical classroom, how we get pretty much universal responses that I have had some students react to it like, no, they wouldn't get out of the car even though they were male and big, but they were also black. And that gave me the sense that being black in that environment would impose some other structures on their expected behavior, because they have been trained to expect a different reaction if they behave that way. Right? So they might have actually felt that that was an imperative to interfere, but at the same time restrain themselves because their actions could be interpreted in a different way than being helpful, right? So that's all interesting to me. But what that does go to show, if we start trying to figure out how this structuring occurs to make us rational, the answers that are developed are kind of intriguing. Psychology. If you notice in the test questions, one of the questions I posed for you in this section regarding Kant in this sense here. So here's the test, which works out to be the final test too, right? Same arrangement as the first two tests. Describe how Hume argued that metaphysics is not possible, right? That the whole issue regarding the a priori, can there be a synthetic a priori? No, but that's precisely where metaphysics theories come from, is presuming that we can know the synthetic a priori. Since we can't actually have answers to those kinds of questions. How does Kant's response to Hume start modern psychology? Is the one that's pertinent to this. Because people started trying to figure out, well, Kant is right. The phenomena is structured by us. And if you're a rational person, you structure it a certain way. So how does that structure show up? Where does it come from? And so is it biology? Is it our basic biological nature? Perhaps that's something that Kant believed. After all, his actual first book is a pragmatic anthropology. So a study of man, pragmatic, very much used the same way that the concept of pragmatism becomes the American philosophy, right? So it's practical. What's the practical nature of human beings that structures this way? But psychology tries to figure this out. One example of where psychology went with this was Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is an image, right? So auf Deutsch, if I have a Gestalt, I have an impression, right? This image of something. Does that get structured by our physical biology? I don't know if you've ever had anyone give you the Rorschach test. You ever taken that?
I've heard that, yeah.
Now's when I tried to see if I can remember how to spell it. And I bet close enough. So images. Oh.
You don't want to hit them.
No, I don't want.
Oh, yes.
So if we look at the Rorschach test, I think there were like 50, I don't know how many images they were. These were ink blots. And they're bilaterally symmetrical. So basically they sprinkled ink on a page, folded it so that it became a bilateral ink blot. So it has no actual structure, it's all happenstance, the way the ink would happen but folded. So it's bilateral. But basically what a psychiatrist or psychologist, I think it was a psychiatrist, would do is show you these and act very much like a straight automaton, not respond to what you say. Keep a straight face, because they don't want to interfere personally in what you're doing. This is before computers and everything, right? So they'd show you this, and you're supposed to tell them what you saw. I did get to take one of these in the old way when I first applied to seminary back in after graduate school. I forget what year that was, 70, before I joined the Army, obviously. 75, 76, something like that, 1976. I took this at, I think it was Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia, because the diocese wanted to make sure that I wasn't crazy. Right? So if they were going to send me to seminary, they wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy. And one way to diagnose a crazy person was to give them a Rorschach test. So I went to my appointment, sat there at the table with this guy who showed me these cards, and asked me to describe what I saw in the card. And this is a game, you're playing a game, you're trying to convince the person that you're normal, right? And of course, in our heart of hearts, we all know that none of us are actually normal, we're just pretending, right? Remember, I already had my master's degree in philosophy, so I already knew that it was just pretense. I wasn't really normal, I was just acting normal. So the thing is, I want to act normal for this guy, because I want him to say, yes, he's normal. So that, whatever, I could end up going to seminary if we ended up doing. By the way, we ended up not deciding to do that. We were accepted at 2 seminaries, General Seminary in New York and EDS in Boston, which was cool. It was interesting to visit them both and be interviewed and so on. But as you know, I actually decided, wow, I don't want to be poor anymore. So I joined the Army to make money. That could be a laugh, but no. So anyway, so here I am sitting opposite this guy, and I know how the game works. I'm supposed to actually see things in these ink blots. You cannot just respond to him and say, it's an ink blot. That's another stinking ink blot. That's an ink blot. And they're all just ink blots. That's all they are. That would be true. But the thing is, that's not going to pass the test. You're supposed to play the game, right? So I'm supposed to see things. So, of course, you get butterflies, you get bats, you don't want to see a raving maniac stabbing somebody to death. There are limits on how you play this game, right? Because you're trying to say, what would a normal person see in this, and then say that relatively rapidly, right? You don't want to just sit there and dawdle for, okay, this is just another ink blot. It looks like a guy squatting and taking a huge crap. No, you don't want to say that, right? That. Terrible. And obviously he hasn't seen the Squatty Potty commercial yet, so he doesn't know how to do it properly. I'll have to erase that part off of the tape. That'll be on YouTube. Can you imagine? I'll have to link to the Squatty Potty commercial so that click. So that's the Rorschach. Well, what's it supposed to suggest? It's supposed to suggest that somehow, if you're a normal person, your perceptions of things will be organized along certain socially accepted ways. You will see something. And there is obviously something to the whole idea of the Gestalt. So for example, if you're driving your car down the street, if you have a car, and you have a radio in your car, right, and you're playing music, right, and you see a pedestrian walking along, here's a test you can make. As you're watching the pedestrian, notice that the pedestrian will walk in beat with the music you're listening to in the car. And that's despite the fact that the pedestrian obviously can't hear the music in your car. That's assuming that you're not one of those people that plays the radio so that the sides of the car goes womp, womp, right? No. So the pedestrian can hear the music. You can, and you see the person, you'll notice that the person walks in beat with the music. And the real test is change the station and notice that he'll change his walking to match the beat. How can that be? Well, it's obviously not the case that he's actually walking in beat with the music. It's the way you're perceiving him. You put things into a particular set of patterns, right? So we do actually perceive things in patterns. But where do those patterns come from? Contemporary studies on, say, how the eye reacts to things says that we have these little computers. Each individual cone or receptor sees a bit of light, and then it's done for a while. It has to recharge itself. But in doing that, it passes the information on to the other receptors so that they can look for that to see how it continues in the next kind of nanosecond or whatever, right? So we actually have computers, so to speak, in our eyes that are programmed to watch for certain patterns so that we can focus on things, so we can notice, oh, that's a car, I should be concerned about the car, it's coming down my road. I have some cones tell me about the edges, I have other cones that tell me about the colors, I have other cones that tell me about the speed, or parts of my brain. There's actually like a filtering system, just to see, for example, that this is the letter A. I have a whole string of different filters in my brain that tell me, well, this line goes this way, this is horizontal, this is an angle, this is et cetera, et cetera. So I have all these filters all involved that enable me to recognize that that is the letter A. And I have to be trained in order to do that. So if you're not looking for the letter A, you're not going to notice it, right? If I'm not looking for a whale sign, and I know what whale sign is, I could be looking at the same horizon as an Eskimo elder who's looking in the same place, and he can see the whale. And I have no clue what he's looking at, right? So it's a trained ability to be able to recognize these certain kinds of things going on in our environment. So culture's involved. It's not just our biology, it's also our culture that trains us to notice certain things. And as a result, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of things going on in our environment that we're not paying attention to. I don't see everything in the room all at once. My mind apparently memorizes the particular situation, and from then on, what I'm noticing are the changes in that environment. So movements will happen. But not everything else is basically my memory telling me that the room has not changed. Right? So I'm not actually seeing the whole picture moment by moment. My mind is very active in selecting just a few things, which, by the way, is economically very important for us because it takes an awful lot of mental energy to focus on the whole picture all the time, and we don't have it. We don't have that much energy. So what we do is we economize, and we kind of just have the basic whole room, and then I'm just focusing on the little changes that take place so that I'm able to know. So an awful lot of this is absolutely on track for Gestalt psychologists, and we're developing that. It's amazing, absolutely amazing to find all the new developments on that. One of the psychologists that's really interesting is Eric Kandel. Age of Insight is his latest book. That's absolutely fascinating. The Age of Insight, right? So this is the age when we began to recognize that there were human characteristics that are structuring how we perceive the world. And they limit us. So this was actually considered a narcissistic hurt, an insult to our ego, recognizing that we have these biological limitations that structure how we perceive the world. And Freud comes along and points out that we have drives, we have biological drives, he calls them, right, that have to be satisfied one way or the other. So another theory that comes along besides the Gestalt theory is the Freudian point of view that argues that as we go through various stages in our development, we end up focusing on different things. So some of those stages are pretty famous, right? The oral stage, where at birth, our everything goes in the mouth, right? And I hate to say it, but it's true. We all know what shit tastes like. It's one of those things. I remember the very first time my oldest son was 4 weeks or so old. I forget how old he was when he first discovered shit, but at some point he did, and he obviously put it in his mouth. And my wife, being a young mother, absolutely had no idea, what this was going to do to our child. She was in tears. She was in a panic. She called the doctor. And I'm standing there thinking, it's probably, you know, I had eaten dirt, I thought, this is not going to hurt the child, it's a mess, just clean it up and you're fine. But she called the doctor, and so I could tell by the doctor was like startled that she was concerned about it and just kind of reassuring her that, oh, she doesn't have to take him into the hospital, just check, if, he gets, diarrhea or something, we can treat him with, whatever that fluid is that you can use to make sure, there's, to, whatever, right? But basically, he was fine, no problem. The second child discovered shit and obviously put some in her mouth. And my wife was still concerned, but she didn't call the doctor, no panic, right? We've been through this before now. Third child, now it's like, okay, this happens, right? And fourth child, we opened the bedroom door the one morning, and there she was, on the bed, the crib, with poo on the face, and a sock literally stuck to her cheek, stuff on the wall and everything. And she was obviously having the time of her life. This was absolutely fantastic. And my wife's response, she laughed, she went and got the camera, and she took pictures of this child in that situation. So, so we go through the oral stage, right? Everything goes in the mouth, whether it should go there or not, right? I remember my one brother, when I was old enough to realize this was a dumb thing, and then a roach was walking across the floor, and he picked it up, and he was like this. I could see him. He was going to put that roach right in his mouth. And my mom was like, ah! Got it away from him. What's the next stage? Anybody remember? Oral stage.
Object permanence. When does that happen?
That's not what it is.
Oh.
Piaget is later. Well, there's the oral, then there's the anal stage, right? That's where we discovered all this interesting stuff that's happening down there. So we go through the anal stage, and then comes, now this is Freud. Freud is male, and everyone laughs at this now. The next stage is our sexual organ stage, right? So we begin noticing that, we start playing with that. So that's kind of intriguing. By the way, it's actually much sooner than that we become aware of all of these things. We have a TED Talk. So for example, this professor gives us a wonderful lecture on things we didn't know about orgasm. I'll have to cut this off on the page here.
All right. I'm going to show you a couple of images from a very diverting paper in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. I'm going to go way out on a limb and say that it is the most diverting paper ever published in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. The title is Observations of In Utero Masturbation. Okay, now on the left you can see the hand, that's the big arrow, and the penis on the right, the hand hovering. And over here we have, in the words of radiologist Israel Meisner, the hand grasping the penis in a fashion resembling masturbation.
Why is it not playing?
All right. I'm going to show you a couple of images from a very diverting paper in the the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. I'm going to go way out on a limb and say that it is the most diverting paper ever published in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. The title is Observations of In Utero Masturbation. Okay, now on the left, you can see the hand, that's the big arrow, and the penis on the right, the hand hovering. And over here we have, in the words of radiologist Israel Meisner, the hand grasping the penis in a fashion resembling masturbation movements. Bear in mind, this was an ultrasound, so it would have been moving images, and orgasm is a reflex of the autonomic nervous system. Now this is the part of the nervous system that deals with the things that we don't consciously control, like digestion, heart rate, and sexual arousal. And the orgasm reflex can be triggered by a surprisingly broad range of input. Genital stimulation, duh, but also...
So today we go way beyond certain Freudian stages and recognize that Freud's stages were social constructs on the part of Freud as a result of his studies. And keep in mind that he was in Vienna. His primary patients, like, I can't think of her name right now, it was like Lady N or whatever, are women that are coming to him as a psychiatrist for mental problems, and they all seem to have roughly the same sorts of problems in his way of identifying them. They were all sexual repression problems. So Freud's looking at it from a particular cultural milieu and from a particular socioeconomic status, etc., where these problems are kind of typical. And he's, of course, trying to assume that this is applicable to all human beings as they go through these stages, and he's making them up, basically. So today we study Freud especially for historical purposes because of the age of insight, how it transformed the way we thought about our human nature. We realize that we are not free agents, that we have what Freud called the id, right? So the id essentially is the inner self that has these basic desires, and we have the society that imposes how we're allowed to behave on us. So that society he called the super ego, right? The big self, right? That literally then is going to impose its rules and restrictions on our behavior. And we're trying to satisfy the basic drives that are part of our id, right? And as a result of the merging of these two, we end up with a structure that's very much the answer to Kant's question, you know, how are we structured, right? So the superego imposes this structure on the id, and the compromise, so to speak, is the way we perceive the world, right? That's that structure that we get imposed on our ego, right? And creates the ego. That's what the ego is the merger between the id and the superego. For his patients, they had problems. The superego imposed such severe restrictions on the id that the id could not satisfy its basic needs, and so it sublimated a lot of its behaviors into problems that the ego was trying to face, right? And Freud's attempt to solve this was the couch talking cure, right, psychotherapy, where the individual would basically relive all of the times in their life where the superego imposed these severe restrictions on them, so that basically you could work your way out of those problems. It takes 40 years, sometimes never works. Perhaps what was really being cured was the person's lack of friendship by having an associate with the psychiatrist. Who knows? Contemporary psychiatrists still seem to want to impose a particular structure on how individuals mature. One of them, one of my favorites, Irvin Yalom, Staring at the Sun, I think was his latest So Irvin Yalom, staring at the sun, overcoming the terror of death. For folks that follow Yalom, and a lot of psychiatrists do, the thing that really, really worries us most is knowing that we're going to die and somehow dealing with that expectation that death is going to happen. And so he interviews different patients. They explain their problems to him, and he says, well, what you're really worried about is that you're going to die. Whoa, you're right, that's what it is, you know, now I feel much better, you know. Another way that psychology develops a response to this is Carl Jung, so Jungian psychology. And Jung gives us a kind of a linguistic basis for if I spell psychology right, maybe not. Now, Jung was a follower of Freud, although he was not younger. He was a little old. Sorry.
Why did you say that?
Pardon? You knew that was coming. You guys have listened to me long enough to know how that works. But for Carl Jung, the symbols that we use, the concepts that we have, literally structure this, and that makes it a much more social, cultural history thing for Jungian psychologists. And by the way, one of his followers is Joseph Campbell. And notice there's a Joseph Campbell's dead now, but we have tremendous impact by Campbell. In fact, one of the things especially I find intriguing is George Lucas was one of his students. In fact, George Lucas refers to Joseph Campbell, rather, as his Yoda. So that's kind of intriguing. And if we look at, there's obviously a very full site here, but if we look at the mono myth. If you look at the monomyth, this is a result of Joseph Campbell's work. He did a book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And what he does basically is look at all of the greatest stories that we have in all sorts of traditions. Maybe as many traditions. I've got the book. It was actually kind of a boring book because it's just a litany of, you know, this story did this story did this, and so on. And out of all of that, he compiles these main events that have to be in the story if we're going to like the story. And as a result of this, by the way, you could go ahead and construct an absolutely fantastic story. So George Lucas, by the way, decided, wow, let me try this. I want to make a cheap film using this exactly. And so he made Star Wars. And if you're familiar with Star Wars, it's coming out again. You know, so it's not over yet, and he's obviously a billionaire. The last time I saw George Lucas interviewed, he was talking with Charlie Rose, and he's in the process of building a museum in Chicago. Charlie Rose looked at him and said, "You have enough money to build a museum in Chicago?" And he goes, "Well, yeah." Of course, you know. So you know, George Lucas used this, and so here's the outline. You know, this is how you make a terrific movie. The interesting thing is that you can make this. It applies to Jesus. So if you look at the narrative of Jesus, that applies to him. It applies to Harry Potter. It applies to, you know, lots of students have pointed out, oh yeah, it's the same as this story. It's this story. It's this. You know, how easy is it for us to see virtually all the stories that we like basically described this way. The one that disturbs me the most, though, is oh dear God.
Really?
Is if you look at the trailer.
Welcome to the home of the rich and famous.
I'll get you anything you want.
Yes, I will.
No, not you, Patrick.
Where no one is more pampered and privileged than the Beverly Hills Chihuahuas.
It's not easy to find a mate with papers.
Hey, talk to the paw.
But Poppy is the one dog who's his own man.
Corazon!
Oh,
Lovely!
Who is that hunky chihuahua?
If you ever need someone to lick inside your ears, I would be most honored.
woof.
I'm about to entrust you with my greatest treasure.
You take good care of her.
Wake up! Come on!
Oh, no, she didn't.
But everything is about to go south.
We're going on a trip.
Mexico!
Hello.
Hola and adios.
Hold your tacos.
Now,
Chloe's in trouble. I mean, come on, fool, let's go.
the most pampered dog in Beverly Hills is 1,000 miles from home.
Don't you speak any Spanish?
Why would I speak Spanish?
Hello, you're Chihuahua, mija.
And this rebel and his crew
Say hello to my little friends.
are on a mission
Let's go get Chloe.
that's off the leash.
I'm gonna kick some tail.
Don't eat me, I got a wife and 300 kids to feed.
Nice legs. For the love of a banana.
Let's get out of here.
Walt Disney Pictures presents
I could use a little help.
the greatest Chihuahua movie
Oh, yeah.
of all time.
It's like three.
It's Mindy, Beverly Hills Chihuahua.
Hi, I'm Viv. I want to talk to Chloe. Would you put her on? Hi, honey.
What's scary about that is it follows the monomyth precisely. There's even a resurrection scene. How many of you have seen it, by the way?
Like a long
Walked
time
it.
ago.
It's sort of
I
one.
barely remember
Yeah.
it. I just remember that they had like barking powers or something. It was weird.
That's the force, right? You know, if you follow the myth, the hero discovers that they have certain powers, and then they need a mentor to help them train up these powers, and then they end up engaged against the evil. First a little bit, then a little bit more, then a little bit more, and then finally ends up in the crisis where basically she ends up sacrificing herself for her friends by, no, not dying on the cross, but by attacking Diablo, mija, right, which is devil, right? You know, so it's blatantly following the monomyth actually throughout. And yes, it's the bark that is the force that the Chihuahuas have, etc. So, you know, watching that, I'm like horrified. I'm sitting there, oh my God. All the kids that watch this movie are going to think, aha, the monomyth is a comedy. And what does that mean when it comes to believing in the major world religion meta-narratives, which are all structured the same way? Can you believe Jesus arose from the dead? If you see your favorite Chihuahua, you know, dead on a stone in a cave, and the light shines on her, and she gets up, and she's resurrected, that's pretty scary, actually. Think about it. Basically, it's teaching kids to laugh at the monomyth, right? Maybe. So, Kant doesn't answer the question of how we structure our experience, but at the same time, he's the one that prompts all these others to try to figure out how to do it. I'm going to stop this.